So good afternoon or good morning, wherever you are. This is the last regular session for today, and at my time, it's exactly 3:45. So we're going to start with Melissa Coates. She's one of the writers of the excellent enterprise deployment Power BI white paper, and she's going to take you to some governing actions in Power BI. So take it away, Melissa.
All right, thank you very much. And yeah, good morning, afternoon, evening to everybody. For me, it's 9:45 in the morning, and I would normally say that I'm talking to you from North Carolina, but today I'm talking to you from Florida. So I have dragged myself away from the lanai and the pool to come in and talk to you. And a sea-doo ride is waiting for me when we are done. So anyways, like you said, my name's Melissa Coates. I am self-employed. My company is Coates Data Strategies, and I actually specialize in this area of, governance, deployment, administration. So I'm really excited to talk to you about this topic. Here's what we have planned today. I'm going to do a very quick overview just so that we level set a few things, and then we're going to run through this idea of top 10 actions. And as we conclude each one of those sections, I'm going to have some suggestions of things you might consider doing right now. And then we're going to have at least 10 minutes reserved for Q&A at the end. The moderators are also going to pay attention to anything that comes in during this session, and we'll stop, 2, 3, 4 times during the session and kind of see what's there. Keep in mind that the middle piece, we're talking about 3 minutes or less for each one of these. So this is very much an overview sort of session of giving you things to think about more than anything else. So if you'd like a copy of these slides, they are available right now. There's a PDF on the presentations page. This session is the second one listed on the page, so you can go grab those right now. And you can either go straight to the presentations page, or if you just go to my main website, you'll see it under the community area. All right, the other thing to know is that I'm assuming that you do use Power BI currently, and you've experienced some successes, that you're familiar with the basics of deploying, but you know that there's always room for improvement. So that's kind of where I'm starting my mindset. So let's dig in. This image is from a Power BI migration document that we just published on the Microsoft Docs website. And I use it because it's actually a really nice overview for this purpose. And by the way, this documentation applies, the vast majority of it applies to really any Power BI deployment, not just migrations. So the reason I am bringing this up is, during setup and evaluation, you're absolutely going to discover some governance planning kind of considerations. And then as you start undergoing creating new solutions, things are going to emerge, as they will when you are doing an actual migration from, say, another tool to Power BI. And so on diagrams like this, we always like to put things like governance and monitoring way at the end of the diagram. But the point really is that it happens at the beginning, in the middle, and the end, and it's iterative and it never ends. So it's really just a matter of always iterating through what's most important to tackle or focus on right now. And so with regard to that, the other thing that we probably want to level set on is, what do we mean by governance? And in this case, we're talking about data governance. And it might mean different things to different people. And as we look at all those terms that are circling around data governance, some of those might be a separate thing in your organization, and some of those might be very, very, very co-joined. So regardless of what you call it, all of these things are actually involved. So for purposes of this session, though, we're really talking about governing the downstream usage of the data in a self-service tool like Power BI. So there's a couple definitions of data governance. This one I like, talking about policies, procedures, standards, roles, responsibilities, right? For a well-managed, data as your enterprise resource. Okay, that's good. Kind of like the second one a little bit better because it's really focusing more on who can do what, who can take what actions with what information, when, in what circumstances, and what methods. So fundamentally, what are we talking here? We're talking about the rules of the road and making sure that your user population knows what they can and cannot do. So I like to frame it as data is governed when it is trustworthy, right? Trusting the data, it's all about that. It's secured, it's managed and audited, and it's documented and understood. So, of course, those are way super high level things, but I really like that as well as a way to kind of frame what are we talking about when we're talking about governance. So we're not talking about telling people, no, you can't do that, right? We're talking about managing the data effectively. And the other thing we all know is that the word governance evokes reactions and emotions from people that aren't always positive, right? And so the reason that users will care about your data governance program is if we make it easier for them, right? We can save them so many headaches with a good governance program. So I'm a firm believer that if we do this well, it can very dramatically improve our user experience. So that's kind of the underlying theme of everything else we're going to talk about here today. So to jump in, number one of our 10 that we're going to run through. The first thing is to really deeply understand what's happening from a centralized versus decentralized perspective. And so you've seen a version of this before. First column is very decentralized. The business authors are managing, preparing, delivering the data end to end. If we go way to the right, a more centralized team like IT or your central BI team is doing all of the end-to-end work. And then you've got that middle blended approach where perhaps the data preparation is being done by more of a centralized team, and the report creation is being handled by the various authors in the different business units. And so the thing that I want you to really realize, if you don't already, is that you already have all three of these probably happening in your organization now. And so understanding who's doing what, right? Finance might be running some things under a very business-led or decentralized model, right? Whereas perhaps sales or marketing might be, at least as a rule of thumb, running a little bit more to the right on this diagram. And so the reason all that's important is because it's going to inform quite a few of your other decisions, knowing how many things and by whom are happening in these different approaches. And then knowing that affects not only the scope of the solutions that are being deployed, right? Personal, team, or organizational, right? How many people are seeing the solution that's deployed, but it also affects the level of oversight that's needed and the amount of flexibility that can be accommodated. So very important stuff. So to conclude this section, I have 3 suggestions for you. The first one is really to kind of look at what's working, what's not, and understand where you might changes or improvements, right? Are you happy with that one particular team that runs very business-led, right? Or would you like to make some shifts, that kind of thing? And then really figure out what groups can and should manage their own content. It's not like that first column is a bad thing if it's done very effectively. And then the notion of what I like to call a co-ownership scenario. So perhaps it's not very black and white in terms of who is owning and managing the content. And so defining what that might look like if in fact it is a very gray situation, and handling that going forwards. All right, let me take a quick pause and check and see if there is a question or two that we want to tackle at this point.
I don't have any questions right now, so we're good.
All right, taking it easy on me. I like it.
Good to
All
go.
right, so
Yeah.
number 2, data trustworthiness. This is kind of one of my big key topics. So in terms of data trustworthiness, one of the best ways that you can start to improve that is to start reducing the number of data sets that you have. And so the reuse of data in Power BI is done through what we call a shared data set. And so in this depiction, what it's showing is one data set that's serving multiple reports. And so this is kind of the canonical example of managed self-service BI. But I'm going to put a spin on it. I'm going to say that to do managed self-service BI, we don't have to say IT owns the data. Certain data has to be tightly controlled, right? And has to be centralized. But who owns and manages it can be up for debate in certain organizations, right? It's the classic, it depends. But even if you have a business unit that is taking responsibility for managing that data, my position is they can still start using this paradigm of improving their own trustworthiness by consolidating the data. And so the formal name for this that Microsoft has been using is called discipline at the core and flexibility at the edge, which kind of makes sense, right? We've got a lot of control over that data set in the middle. Another way that I've heard it, a little bit humorously, but another way I've heard it is you can date dashboard, but marry your data model. And from a practical perspective, what this looks like, right, is we have a shared data set and a variety of reports connected to it by a live connection. So the other thing that I want to say is that if we start pursuing this route, it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to say one data set rules them all. It doesn't have to be one massive single data set in order to get value from this if you just have fewer data sets. So I spoke with a customer recently that without strong governance in place from the beginning has found themselves in a position where they've got about 3,000 reports and about 3,000 data sets. And that is in fact a big warning symbol. So things you can do right now is start the habit and teach your report authors to decouple your data creation work and your report creation work. Literally separate PBIX files in Power BI Desktop from the beginning. It's a little bit different habit, but that gets us a lot of gains in the long run. And then start using shared data sets to reduce inconsistencies and lessen our compliance concerns. And then certified data set endorsements are really important. And so what I propose is that not only do you use the certification endorsement when it makes sense, but have a specific review and approval process for it so that you absolutely make certain that if it's certified, that equates trustworthiness in the mind of the person that is, consuming that data or creating a new report from it or whatever. Okay, let me take a quick stop and see if there's any questions that came in on that particular topic.
No, everything is still very clear, Melissa. No questions.
Awesome. Okay. All right, so this one and the next one very much go together. So let me start with this kind of high level idea of a guiding principle. And before we get into that, though, let's talk a little bit about this fundamental pull between conflicting priorities and conflicting opinions, right? We all know those are always present, and there's always going to be conflict to a certain degree between how much we can share data and how much we can, need to secure it and so forth. So that's natural. We cannot avoid it. So having said that, what I would like for you to consider is, how are you actually approaching how you think about governance? And so in the governance world, there's a couple different ways we can term this, but people tend to refer to it as, offensive or defensive. And if you're really focused on, the offensive side, you're absolutely focused on, things like revenue and growth and more customers, etc. The defensive strategy, which is more often associated with the word governance, is more about risk reduction and meeting our compliance needs and that sort of thing. And so where this comes in is, depending on your focus, your level of tolerance for some things differs. So on the right, we have this very, very high value on a single version of truth. So that notion of a shared data set I was just talking about, right? And stability, as opposed to if we are over on the left side, we might be able to tolerate a little more chaos there. And so on the defense side, a company like healthcare, for instance, that has extreme data protection needs, right? Of course, they're going to have a firm foot over in the right side, right? But, over on the left, a retail company has the luxury usually of focusing more on the left, right? And if you've ever read any of the Netflix stuff that they produce about, they call it freedom and responsibility. They're absolutely, to the extreme on the left side of this page. So I mention all this because, your needs, what funding you get, what priorities you get handed down, are going to be at least a little bit in both these camps. And your balance of this is going to change over time as maybe your corporate goals change, or maybe your data strategy matures and changes and that sort of thing. So we started this by saying guiding principles. So let's tie this together. So maybe I have a guiding principle of everyone's a data steward. Maybe my CTO, you hear him say this all the time, right? And so something like that is already kind of a cultural norm becomes a guiding principle. And so once we have something like this identified, that, hey, responsibility for our data is, rests with everybody, right? That helps us with consistent decision making. Let me give you another example. Maybe we agree on a principle like, we know we have certain critical data elements. Perhaps if we are in healthcare, this is our patient data, right? And that we know not all of our data has the same value and needs to be managed and monitored differently. And while this might seem almost a little bit obvious, right? But once we have some of these really truly identified, right, then we can start formulating policies around it. And if we have our executive sponsor, our key stakeholders have already agreed on the guiding principles, we already have teeth in it, and we already have focus on where to go with our data policies. So one is kind of give some thought to, what is your why? Are you focused more on offense or defense? And should you be, right? Has this been a default position or a very purposeful position? And then start trying to formulate some of these guiding principles, literally get them down on paper before any data policies are crafted. And that takes us to the next one that really kind of goes hand in hand with this thought process. So a data policy is just really a thing, a document that tells us what are we doing and why, right? As a user of Power BI, I could refer to this policy to understand what I'm allowed to do. And ideally that should align to our guiding principle, which should turn around and align to some organizational objectives. Associated with policies are things like processes, procedures, standards, right? A process would just be, hey, how are we implementing the policy? A standard is, how are we measuring it? And all of these things need to be supportable and auditable. So let me give you an actual example, though, of what I mean by this. Let's say we have an organizational objective of improving our decision making, right? We want to be more data driven, you know, that kind of thing. And so we've said, yes, we've identified these critical data elements, and we know that we need to do certain actions with them in order to manage them most effectively. So I might have a policy that says something to the effect of, granted this is all super simplified, but any data set that contains critical data elements, we need to have data definitions that are documented. We need to have our sensitivity labels assigned, and those data sets should be certified. That, you know, that kind of thing is what I mean by policy, right? Helping your authors understand, here's what I really should do with this data. And so a couple of processes that might go along with that is my data certification process. And what I mean by that is, if I'm going to certify data, I think it needs to go through things like a data source review, a data model review, a security review, the data accuracy has been validated, all those sorts of things, right? And then data definitions, how and where do I handle that? Those sorts of things. So the practical how-to underneath that lofty policy. And then lastly, our standards, and here I'm just using this, I'm presenting it this way because it's standard lingo in the data governance world, right? But really this is just our measurable metrics. So we always want to be able to figure out, are we being effective and successful, et cetera, especially if, you know, we need to get funding every year for this program, et cetera. But, you know, maybe all of our certified data sets need to have an owner assigned, and you know, 85% of them should be re-reviewed twice a year. What I mean by that is maybe we did that initial certification approval process at the beginning, but it's undergoing changes over time. And how does that happen? It's probably more lightweight after the first approval process. And so what happens, you know, after that point, that kind of thing. So what you want to do is kind of pick your most important thing to focus on, right? You do not want to go and say, suddenly we need to create 50 policies. Less is more here. And definitely there's a balance to be found between, hey, we have one document that kind of lists all the important stuff versus a whole bunch of smaller documents. But something like a data ownership policy is a good place to start. And it's actually not as simple as it sounds. So let's say you already have some data governance in place, and you already know that the owner and the source system for this particular set of data is Mark, right? But your self-service authors have taken that data, used it in their data models. Now that it's in self-service data sets being used for analytics in Power BI, how does Mark's responsibility and accountability for that data change in terms of accuracy of the data, right? So a data ownership policy is, you know, not as simple as it sounds. And a data usage and distribution policy, what I mean by that is, let's say you have defined 3, 4, 5 sensitivity labels or data categories, you know. And so what you should have is a policy along with those that says, if it's assigned this particular level, you are allowed to do this and not allowed to do that. And a common thing is certain levels may not be shared with external users, things like that. Think about what's already been decided, right? Things, if you have a data governance board, things you have a change management board, right? What's already decided, and we just piggyback along, or with the slightest little tweak to accommodate self-service BI. And then these data policies, again, I want them to be short, clear, not behemoth, awful, disgusting documents, right? But make them available, easily searchable, easily referenced by your users, so that when you have educated them, they need to refer back to them. They can certainly do that. Okay, let's see where we're at. Ooh, I'm 2 minutes early. Very exciting. Let me stop and do a quick check for if there's any questions that have come in.
Yeah, there's actually one question, Melissa. It's from Christopher. He's asking, is talking in a uniform way about what the numbers represent considered offensive or defensive?
Wow, yeah. I don't know that one doesn't strike me as either, right? We might call that neutral.
Yeah.
We'll call that one Switzerland, right? So, data accuracy is really kind of a given, right? That's we started with data trustworthiness back on item 2 or something, right? So I feel that one's kind of a given to be a focus regardless of where you're at. Might have to think more about that question though and see if I have a deeper, better answer. Okay.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. All right, so we've talked a little bit so far about things like our guiding principles and our policies, right? The things that we might want to consider doing. But now let's start talking a little bit about the who, the expectations, roles, responsibilities, that kind of thing. So remember when we talked about this way at the very beginning? And I bring this up again because your decisions here absolutely affect how your roles and responsibilities are going to look. And so what you need to do is define roles and responsibilities within each one of these areas that are shown. There's going to be, sometimes quite a few of them, or at least a few. And so the whole idea, of course, is people know what's expected of them, what they can do, what they cannot do. But self-service BI is an odd beast, right? People have different levels of capabilities and levels of interest in things that they want to get involved in. So there needs to be some flexibility as well built in to the roles and responsibilities, so that if Sally falls under this particular role, but she wants to go above and beyond, how do we actually accommodate that? So I firmly believe that the people on our front lines, right, those actual content authors that are doing the work, are the foundation of our entire governance program. Explain to you what I mean by this. Starting at level 1, right, we've got those people in the business units, right, and ancillary teams, right? We might have, IT that helps with certain things, the BI team, etc., right? But here I'm really talking about the content authors, right? The people that are publishing data, they're setting up security, they're doing, their own data management, their own data stewardship, their own data validations, right? The true self-service people plus the corporate BI people, okay? This is the foundation, right? If they know what to do properly, we have started with a solid foundation. So on top of that, regardless of what you call it in your organization, right? If you have a center of excellence formally or not, or a data governance team formally or not, there needs to be a group of people that set up your policies and so forth of what is and isn't allowed with regard to Power BI. And that helps support your business units with what they need to do their job one, as the foundation of all of this. And then up to level 3, so our audits and our compliance teams and that sort of thing. So we could consider internal and external audit levels 3 and 4, right? Because of course the last thing that we want is external audit to have a finding. But to keep it simple, I've lumped them into there together. So as you can imagine, the better job we do at the bottom, that helps things as we move up the chain of responsibility. So we can think of this basically somewhat as multiple checks and balances. So first, hopefully you have clarity on who your executive sponsor is, right? Who owns Power BI, so to speak, and how much authority this person has for implementing policies that apply across the organization. So, back to that whole 3-column thing, not everybody is going to be governed the same, but when we can have consistency and the same rules for everybody to keep things simple, we want to do that, and hopefully your sponsor has the authority to make that happen if you need, the authority to get things done. Define all of your roles and responsibilities as best you can, right? And where possible, actually add them to the job description, right? If someone's accountable formally for that kind of work, when it makes sense to. Some things are kind of voluntary, but when it makes sense to, right? Actually, literally update the job description. And then that whole idea of communicating with and teaching your content authors and creators, the people in that level 1 foundation, how important their role really is for safeguarding data and the responsible use of data. We've just totally changed the thinking here of us saying, no, you can't do that, to them really being part of why things are done the way they're done, and that kind of thing. Makes it more collaborative, if that makes sense. All right, so let's move next to content delivery. Teensy tiny little topic, right? In Power BI, we have a ton of options for how content's being delivered, right? So as a super, super high level, right? We've got the service, we've got report server, we've got embedding, but even within the service, the whole notion of spaces, apps, and sharing, right? Or subscriptions and exports, right? Those are a way to deliver content to others, right? So the level of flexibility here is great. But it can be overwhelming for some people. And what can also happen is some people, everybody's busy, right? So sometimes a person learns one technique, like sharing, for instance, my favorite one to pick on, and then overuses that particular technique because they learned how to get that done. And so I am of the opinion that this is one of a handful of things that your people that are producing content will absolutely appreciate guidance on what to use when. And notice I use the word guidance here. I'm not saying that this is a firm policy. I'm saying this is more like best practices, rules of thumb, suggestions. And so one of those that we put into the white paper in the most recent release is this one, right? Just kind of a quick, should I use an app, a workspace, or sharing for distributing my content? And so, Wukash from the Power BI team kind of helped me with how the Power BI team specifically sees this, right, between it being official content and collaborative content. So something like this is what I mean by guidance, right? So not 3 pages of dense text if you can avoid it, just quick rules of thumb. And that will help somewhat reduce risk as well, because your preferences are known and people are a little more well educated. So the idea here is if we do need to balance some risk with ease of use as well. And then there's workspace management, right? Usually what my opinion about that is if your users in your organization are allowed to go create their own team sites or their own SharePoint resources, Power BI usually follows suit with regard to being able to create workspaces by people in the organization. But I've talked to so many customers that they're so worried that that will create major chaos. And naming convention junkie that I am, I can totally appreciate that. So have a strategy. If you do lock it down, absolutely make sure that you respond to a request for a new workspace, I mean, as fast as possible, right? Within an hour or two, if you can, kind of a thing. Have them submit a little form with what you need. Make sure a support team can get to it, because otherwise people are going to use another workspace that wasn't intended for the purpose, or they're going to use sharing. So don't make it a big hurdle, but just have a strategy. And then consider separate data workspaces from reporting workspaces. So at the end, I'll give you some URLs, but I've got a video that talks about this a little bit. That notion of content ownership. So if we've got different people managing data and different people managing reports, we can start deploying them to different workspaces. And that will allow us to more easily determine who owns what, but it also will help us have more granular security, because if you only have the build permission over to the workspace where the data set resides, not only do we not need to just use the honor system for I won't change the data set, only reports, but row level security will actually work because we only have read and build permissions. So we get some technical advantages as well. All right, let me take a quick pause and see if we have any questions that have come in. I'll take that as a no. So this
Melissa,
one.
Actually, we have one question from
Oh,
Christoph.
yes. Hello.
Your governance also depends of your audience. You can speak of this and that when the people know the subject, but when you go wild and distribute your reports, you need to be careful. What is your opinion on this?
I'm not sure I understood that question at all. Can you say it again?
So he mentioned that your governance also depends of your audience.
Yeah.
You can speak of this and that when the people know when the subject. No, I'm sorry. You can speak of this and that when the people know the subject, but when you go wild and distribute your reports, you need to be careful.
Yeah, no question, no question. So most of what I'm focusing here. Yeah, most of what I'm focusing here on is, your content authors, right? But you're absolutely right. The content consumers are very important too. I think, kind of back to the 3 columns, certainly somewhat, but you're right. There's a project I did once for a reinsurance company, and holy cow, those actuaries are like the most sophisticated self-service BI users I've ever seen, right? And that's a wildly different thing than, our normal, finance person that we think of as a power user. That's wildly different from somebody that's just a casual consumer. So absolutely, I think it's a valid point, and I just don't know that I have a specific gem to share with that, but it's an excellent point that there's so many variations to account for.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Okay, system administration decisions. Have you had anybody that has been confused and irritated? And the thing is, people read things online about what they can do with Power BI, and oh, it doesn't work. And some people will know who to call, who to ask. Other people will just, sigh and move on and do something different. So there's a whole bunch of places that the Power BI administrator has an effect on user experience. The biggest one that we talk about all the time are the tenant settings, but even things like beyond your Power BI administrator, your Microsoft 365 administrators have influence over, you know, who's allowed to start a pro trial, or if self-service license purchasing is allowed by an individual department, right? So here's the thing. What we don't want is a Power BI administrator saying, oh, I'm going to turn off exports. I don't think that's a good idea, right? Could this person be absolutely spot on with their decision because they know the needs implicitly? Yes. Could this person be overzealous and a little off point? Yes. So what we want to do instead is review your settings, right? Make sure they're all purposeful. This is what we want. This is not just something somebody with permission decided to set. Document those settings for the internal Power BI community, including which group to ask to be a part of if you want to do this thing, like push apps to users, for instance, something like that. Once it's documented and broadly available, then people don't just go and make changes because they thought it was a good idea. At least I hope not. And then take a look at who's a Power BI administrator, right? If you have 40 of them, that's too many. Reduce the number of people if possible to just a small number. If you have too many, it's probably because they wanted to go in and be able to see things like what's set for the tenant settings. And if you turn around and document them on your internal site, that will take care of that concern. Now, the next thing that I want to talk a little bit about is, you know, analyzing this gold mine of data that you have available to you that can really influence your adoption, your auditing, and your training efforts. So I'm referring to this as kind of just general activity analysis. So this would be getting data from the Power BI activity log, and then also some related APIs. And so, you know, first you want to know what content is being used most, right? And if someone has shared a report from my workspace and it's suddenly getting hundreds of views per day, is that a good thing? And should we maybe move it and make sure it's better supported than, you know, in someone's my workspace? How about changes that happen? And in addition to content changes, I mean security changes. And this data is positively invaluable for your compliance audits and security investigations, things like that. In addition to having the actual activity log data for security, one thing you might want to do is take snapshots of security. So grab the data from the API, keep a weekly snapshot of who your memberships are in your workspaces, that kind of thing. Then you've got the absolute whole picture. You've got the idea of adoption. So usage itself is a big part of adoption, but it's not the only part, right? So more usage is not always positive, right? We don't want always more downloads or always more data models, that kind of thing. So, you know, it helps us understand, are people using this tool or this data the way that we intended them to do? Trustworthiness, right? One of my favorite topics. So are we seeing dataset certification? Are we seeing dataset reuse the way we want to? Licenses, right? Are pro user licenses being used for actual authorship as opposed to just viewing? In which case we might, you know, switch to using premium or something like that for those people. Or what about finding users that have signed up for a trial, but they don't have a pro license assigned yet, meaning they're going to have a service interruption here soon. Usage patterns, right? Do we really understand what's happening? We maybe thought people would use this beautiful dynamic dashboard, right? We've all experienced this, and then we see oh, all they're doing is exporting the data. Or maybe we're seeing a huge number of email subscriptions happening. And is that really what we wanted and intended? That kind of thing. This could also help us find training opportunities, and maybe it's more like user education opportunities by this. But if you see people doing too much sharing out of my workspace, or you see a lot of duplicative data sets or one report per data set being published over and over and over, right? This opportunity to go and teach people a better way to do things. And then just, are you suddenly seeing something that you don't want to see necessarily, like a huge number of exports suddenly just happened yesterday, that sort of thing. So typically the kind of solution here that we're talking about is we get data from a variety of different places, right? Starting with the activity log at the top, some various APIs. We will compile all of the raw data. I absolutely prefer getting it into a database with a structure as opposed to going straight to Power BI, because I have things like snapshots, because I have some things that are doing some data cleansing. The activity log data can be a little wonky sometimes, so that gives us a place to handle all of that in a little stronger way, maybe than at least I feel comfortable with taking it directly to Power BI, right? So we kind of have this end-to-end solution where we can basically do BI on BI. So it takes a while to get there, but what I would want you to start with is start retrieving all of the data if you haven't already. And start learning from this data, right? Figure out how it's really being used by the user population and take action, right? This can be used just for, backwards auditing and compliance, or you can really use it to help improve your user's experience and so forth. All right, number 9 and 10 really very much go together. So this next one is really all about your internal community. And so there's a number of different aspects to this that we'll briefly review. But I believe that one of the best ways we can decrease risk is just by turning around and educating people on what we want and need them to do. So with regard to support and help, we've got the traditional issue resolution and troubleshooting and that kind of thing, but we can also do things like people can ask for a best practice review, right? Or office hours, advisory services type of things, right? That really can form a nice partnership between the user population and the people that are doing the support and the help. Obviously, it depends on how you staff it, but that piece on the bottom right is very, very important no matter who does it. Training, right? We all know we need to do a little bit of training for our consumers, a lot of training for our authors, but in addition to actual training on how to use Power BI, there's a lot of value in a focus on, hey, here's our organizational process. Here's our additional content on things like data literacy and so forth. So from a training perspective, what you probably want to do is curate links to the things that are around how to use Power BI and focus your effort on these are the things that matter most within our organization. And knowledge sharing, here we've got things like announcements and Q&A, and there's office hours again, right? But what the other piece of it is your peers, so the other authors in the organization that are doing lunch and learns and sharing something that they learned or how to use a new feature, that kind of thing can be so powerful, right? And your peer says it, they were able to do it, surely I should be able to do it, right? It's kind of a different message delivery system. Resources, having some pre-built resources and templates, sample reports, right? Those are huge, especially for new authors that might be a little bit intimidated with where in the heck to start. And then you've got your company specific resources, right? Your business glossary and your data definitions, that kind of stuff. And things like data source guidance, right? You need to get data out of this one very persnickety system, and how do you go about doing that? And lastly, documentation, things like frequently asked questions, best practices, your tenant settings documentation we talked about, your data policies that we talked about, all that sort of thing. So the best choice for this is to have some sort of Power BI hub for all of this content. And wherever is convenient and kind of fits your normal work habits would be helpful. And then once that's set up, update your tenant settings so that the help menus in Power BI itself direct users to your Power BI hub. And you can also put, links inside, your app menus or, various other places in reports and that kind of stuff if you choose to. So very, very closely tied to this is your data culture. And Matthew Roche, who, if you haven't seen his data culture series, absolutely go check it out if you're into this kind of topic that we're talking about today. He says a data culture promotes and encourages data-driven decisions by more stakeholders in more parts of the organization, right? The whole notion of self-service BI. And so when we're talking about a data culture, one of the first things that comes up is, do we need to create a center of excellence? And so, that would depend. That's becoming very much a common norm that we see a lot of customers do. Years ago, a lot of customers would call it like a BI competency center. But, who's going to actually nurture this whole idea of a Power BI community? And who's going to know who your network of Power BI, champions and experts are? Who's going to manage this governance model, right? Define those policies and so forth. And who has that cross-departmental view into what's actually happening? So, my suggestion is that you need some team that handles this responsibility, right? Is it officially called a COE, right? That depends on how your organization manages it. But decide who will nurture this community and make sure they actually have the time, the focus, and the motivation, right? You want them to love it and want to do this. And then your guidelines and your policies, not only do we want to create them and toss them out in a SharePoint library or whatever, right? But we need to actively promote them and make sure that, they have this balance between controlling what people do and empowering what people do. And then have defined specific measurable goals for the community and your governance program as a whole, so that you can actually have numbers around what have you done, and if you need funding or you need support, right, then you have this built-in information that helps you. So these are the 10 that we have been through. They were obviously all very high level and very much differ based on how your company manages things. But the final thought I will leave you with is that you have two paths, right? You've got this idea of, hey, we're going to build out this governance groundwork, this whole framework, right, that we want to use. And that's a big deal. That's going to take you years. Then you've got the handling your most pressing needs. So you're always going to go back and forth on the paths. You're going to devote time to both and just do this in continual, iterative, slow baby steps, right? Slow and steady progress, focusing on, small projects that span, both paths or both, absolutely is the way to go. So here are all of the links. I will leave these up as we do the final set of Q&A. There's also a variety of links available here as well with regard to the white paper that has been mentioned, the adoption frameworks, Matthew's data culture series, that kind of thing. So here are my links, and we've got just a few minutes left to take whatever questions we might have lingering.
Okay, Melissa, we have one question in the chat from Kurt. What are your thoughts on how we can best reconcile governance policies with data maturity and availability at the organization? He also gives an example. For example, the export of certain data is not allowed, but users want or need to export for a specific use case that is otherwise not supported or business relevant.
Oh gosh, bring out the big guns. So you're absolutely right that data maturity and, you know, data strategy and all that stuff absolutely go hand in hand with governance. So I agree with that initial statement. The export capability, one of my wishes is that that becomes a more granular setting over time, to where someone, if we turn off one kind of export, right, it doesn't also turn off other things, you know, like analyze in Excel and whatever. The best option I can think of, wow, I don't even like that option that I'm about to share, though. I think that is very challenging. So, you know, the question would be, is a subscription an appropriate substitute? Can the person instead just get direct access to the data, whether it's the Power BI data set itself, you know, through like a build permission, or even elsewhere, maybe even through a data flow, right? Can we, is there an alternative? So yeah, I think that's a tough problem when it's turned off as a whole. And I've seen some blogs about, you know, turning that off, and I feel like that's such a big heavy hammer when you turn that off. I would much rather see it on and watch the activity log and see that it's being drastically overused. So let's go talk to these people, figure out what they're doing, and figure out, can we help with a better way? Tough one.
Indeed, a tough one, but I think most of the organizations have a challenge with this. But I completely agree with your answer. So it's the best way to not block it all off from the beginning, but see what people are doing and just logging it. I don't think we have any other questions left. I only see congratulations with the presentation, thanks so much, etc. So I think people had a lot of interesting things to think about and to implement at their organization.
Excellent. Good. Well, then we've got 3 minutes left, so, or 2 now, but good. Well, then we'll give you a couple of extra minutes then for a break before Rohan's keynote that comes on next.
Okay, thank you very much, Alyssa.
All right, thanks everybody, and have a good rest of your day wherever you're at.
In the meeting chat, I also added the feedback form, so please fill it in. It will be nice for Melissa to have a review of her session. Also, because we are doing this virtually. And also the next session of Rohan Kumar, the link towards the session will be posted in this meeting chat and probably also within the general track. You can also follow the link towards the new meeting over here and in the general track.
All right, thanks everybody. Bye.